So I decided this week was a good time to put on a comfy sweater and take a little break from caffeine. But even though I had learned a ton when I made a video on Decaf Espresso, I found that those techniques didn't really transfer over to the V60 particularly well. And the first few coffees that I made were pretty sour and thin. But once I figured out the three things I was messing up, my decafs started tasting a lot better. Now first is adjusting the brew ratio by raising the dose of your coffee. According to Swiss Water, there are less soluble materials in decaf after the decaffeination process, so compensating with a higher dose helps achieve a similar brew strength to regular coffee. For me, this meant updosing about 1 gram over my regular recipe. So the 24 grams of coffee to 400 grams of water I usually use became 25 grams of coffee, which moved the ratio up from a 1 to 16.6 to a 1 to 16. Next is adjusting the grind. A finer grind is helpful to extract more, but you want to be careful and avoid going too fine for a couple of reasons. Number one is that even though there are less soluble materials, decaf is a lot more soluble in general because of the processing. And the roasted coffee also becomes quite brittle compared to non-decaf coffee, which can produce excessive fines when ground that can stall your pour toward the end. Both of these things you want to avoid as they can produce an overly bitter and muddy cup. And this is especially true if you're using a grinder with a very wide particle size distribution. In other words, there are more fine particles relative to the average grind size. Now some flat burr grinders will do this, and many conical burr grinders do this, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because it can add body and sweetness and a little bit more complexity to the coffee. I actually really enjoyed how this coffee was tasting on my Normcore grinder, which is a conical hand grinder. It ended up taking about 5 minutes to brew, while my flat burr grinder was tasting good at about 4 minutes to 4.5 minutes. But it was a bit lighter and lacking in complexity by comparison. Now the way I usually go about finding my grind setting is to shoot for these times, then push a little finer until the coffee starts to taste a little bit dry and papery, and then I'll back it up about one step. At that point, you should be in a good spot. Third, and possibly most important, is getting your pouring technique down. So let's brew some decaf and I'll talk through it in real time. Okay, so again, we're gonna start with 25 grams of coffee and pour a total of 400 grams of water. You wanna shake the bed to level the coffee, and then using a chopstick or the back of a brush, like I did here, create a slight divot. And try not to push down too much since the finer grinds can compact and clump together fairly easily. My first pour is somewhere around 75 to 90 grams, whatever it takes to fully saturate the coffee. Feel free to adjust this depending on your coffee or your grinder. And just to be sure that there isn't any clumping, I like to stir the bed starting low and in the center and working my way up, just barely touching the sides of the V60. Then wait 30 to 40 seconds before pouring up to about 150 grams, almost reaching the sides of the V60 going in slow circles. The goal is to keep the bed relatively flat, but avoid washing coffee down the sides of the filter. This will help keep the flow rate healthy and avoid stalling later. Normally I would swirl a bit here, but for decaf I want to agitate as little as possible and only swirl at the end. I have another technique I want to show to reduce agitation later on that might be helpful depending on how comfortable you are with your kettle. After 10 to 15 seconds, I start the next pour, which goes up to about 275 grams, still moving in a small circle but without hitting the sides of the V60. And you'll see towards the end that I'm going to get a little bit of fines up the side, but still a relatively flat bed. Now for some reason, I used a very small scale for this demo, and I had to shift it a bit because I couldn't see the numbers through the coffee in the carafe. So just imagine with me that this is one single pour going up to 275 and not one that's broken up with a little bit at the end. The last pour goes until 400 grams, and it's hard to see at this angle, but I'm slightly rotating the kettle to get the pouring spout a little bit closer. I couldn't do it much because this is a smaller 1 liter Hario kettle, and I didn't want to spill water everywhere, but I was able to get the spout about 1 inch closer to the coffee. I first saw this technique used by Japanese baristas for osmotic flow and nail drip. It's definitely worth a try if done safely, but please be careful. Better coffee isn't worth spilling hot water on yourself. And I've actually done that once before on a bar shift, and I can say that it is a 0 out of 10 experience. At this point, I like to give the coffee a final swirl and let it drain, but you could also gently tap the sides of the V60 if your brews are stalling at this point. And it's really okay if the drawdown takes a little while. The total brew time on this decaf with the conical grinder was about 4 minutes and 50 seconds. So since we have a minute, this is a great time to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, I promised that this would be in real time, and I'm going to keep the V60 in the corner of the screen so you can keep an eye on it while I travel 1 minute into the future to taste the coffee and leave you with just one more thing to consider about decaf. Nice. Very like dark caramel, like really like rich browning sugars, like almost burnt, but not quite. There's like a pleasant like nuttiness, kind of like an almond sort of thing going on too. Quite nice. One last thing, and that's the coffee itself. It's worth asking your local cafe what processing method was used for their decaf offering. And while it's not a perfect indication of quality, it's certainly a good first sign that they're knowledgeable and can tell you about how good their decaf is. You'll definitely be able to tell if they don't care, and maybe they even think that decaf just sucks, which is not true. But you will have saved yourself a ton of time. And if you're looking to make a better decaf espresso, which remember, as I said in the very beginning of the video, is quite different, you're gonna wanna check out this video right here. I learned a ton when I made a video on decaf espresso. I found that I don't know how to put on a sweater.